Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to discuss the structure and the function of the stomach. Yes, the stomach is part of the alimentary canal, the food canal of which the food travels, but it's sort of specialized in terms of it's a specialized compartment where food is temporarily held and stomach secretions aid in the digestion process. And so let's get into this. It's one of those things. The stomach is something that everyone knows about to some extent. So I hope that you could relate, and some of the things that we're going to discuss are familiar, but maybe we'll pick up some new things. And so, as it turns out, the stomach stores food temporarily, and I say temporarily, potentially for a couple of hours. And then it also performs major digestion of protein in particular. And I say protein because there's an enzyme in particular that's secreted by the stomach that specifically breaks down polypeptides or proteins. And so as you can see here, the stomach is located, the stomach's located in the abdominal cavity. So this is kind of what we're going to talk about here in terms of the body. You could sort of separate the body, but with this muscular structure that separates the thoracic and abdominal cavity. It's called the diaphragm. So just below the diaphragm muscle, right here, the diaphragm muscle is the stomach, and it's sitting over there on what is your anatomical left side. And it's up a little bit higher than I think most people think. I think most people think that their stomach is down here, but in fact, because they have cramps, but that's really your intestines, small intestines. Stomach's in the upper part of the abdominal cavity on the left side. And so just talking a little bit about the anatomy, the esophagus leads into the stomach. The stomach sometimes is described as sort of a J-shaped pouch. And it has like this open area up here called the fundus. It's kind of a generic term. And then there's two rings of muscle that prevent food from backflowing in the esophagus and moving further on into the small intestine. So you want to keep the food in there for a while. So you have sphincters, which are circular rings of muscle. The pyloric sphincter, or the gatekeeper, prevents food from going down in the esophagus. And then you have this sort of what's called lower esophageal sphincter, sometimes referred to as the cardiac sphincter because it's located in close proximity to the heart. And so that keeps the food in there. Here you can see an x-ray of the inside of the stomach. It doesn't always look so perfectly J-shaped because it's highly muscular. And so it's going to be churning and contracting, which helps in the digestion process as well. And so here you have it. You can see here the sphincter closing here and the sphincter closing here, trapping in what is called the gastric juice. And so part of our video today is a discussion of what the contents are of gastric juice. But we could just simply, at this point, to say that the stomach secretes gastric juice, and that churning with the muscular action helps to digest the food. And so there's a lot of movement inside the stomach, a lot of squeezing. And so that's kind of cool. And so here again is a more detailed look at the anatomy of the stomach. Here's your esophagus. Here's that sphincter that I was discussing before, the lower esophageal sphincter. This region right up here, you can get into a lot of anatomy, is sort of the region of the stomach closest to the heart, so cardiac region. Here's the fundic region I was mentioning before, the body of the stomach. Down here is the pyloric sphincter. The duodenum or duodenum, depending on how you want to pronounce that. This little area right here is the pyloric canal, pyloric region of the stomach. You know, like, well, why so many regions? Well, so that physicians have a better way of discussing the location of difficulties, whether it be an ulcer or a tumor or something like that. We can discuss the region more accurately and more profoundly if we define it more clearly. So these are all useful terms. I want to emphasize something though. This inner lining, the mucosal layer, this inner lining, look at all these ridges. Okay, so these are like sort of mountain ridges. And again, this is what that term means, rugae. The rugae literally means ridges of the mucosal layer. And so if you were to take a stomach, and I just happen to have one right here, you could take a look, you could see how the cardiac sphincter or lower esophageal sphincter is really tight right there. And here's the pyloric sphincter. But if I were to open it up like that, you could literally see the rugae, in other words, these folds of the mucosa, and that's increasing surface area right there inside the stomach. And so here's an actual look at a dissected stomach right here. You can see the esophagus here, you can see the rugae here, and you can see the pyloric canal, and then here's the pyloric sphincter right down there. And so these accordion-like, so foldy rugae are very elastic, and they can stretch to accommodate the stomach. If you were to fill the stomach up, it will expand, and it can expand to approximately 2 liters, which I think is quite significantly large. I don't know if any of us are really putting that much food and liquid into the stomach at any given time, but it's quite a lot. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have had this procedure, but physicians can actually look into your stomach. They can look into your esophagus and stomach by using this sort of flexible apparatus called an endoscope. And so this is literally placed. This has a camera and a light, so it has a lens and a light. And you can literally place it in a patient in their mouth and sort of tease it down the esophagus and have it peer inside the stomach. Obviously, the patient would, in order to maintain this, you might need a little sedative to sort of be relaxed while this is happening. But why would a physician do this? Well, I mean, for a number of reasons. They could be looking inside for possibilities of a tumor. They could be looking for an ulcer. Nevertheless, you could biopsy the tissue. In other words, you could take a tissue sample and remove it using this device. And so it's rather informative to the physician. Let's actually take a look. I want to show you this. It's pretty cool, looking inside the stomach. And so I just happen to have it called up right here. Let's take a look at this. Let's make this a little larger. And so this is what it looks like coming down the esophagus. You're going through the esophageal sphincter, cardiac sphincter, and then here we are entering in to the stomach. And you can see the rugae there, and you can see all those juices are the gastric juices. And it's very slippery in there. Okay, and so you could look around and sort of make a diagnosis. You could sort of evaluate what's going on in real time, in color. And so this is often used by physicians to take a look at what is known as the upper GI. So in other words, you can take a look at the esophagus, and you can take a look at the stomach. You can even tease it through and look at the upper part of the small intestine as well. And so let's get back over here. So I thought you might like that. If you wanted to look at further video, I would encourage you to do so. You could take a look on YouTube and find some interesting endoscope video. There's a lot of cool stuff that's out there. So let's talk about this gastric juice. You might be wondering, you saw it in the video, all this liquid. What is that gastric juice? Well, again, you might come into the video with some knowledge of the stomach because it's kind of a popular organ per se. And so you might know that gastric juice is infamously acidic. That's right, the stomach itself, can you believe this? The cells, meaning the mucosal epithelium of the stomach, is capable of secreting an acid, and the acid is hydrochloric acid, and the pH is profoundly acidic. It's about 2, and so that's pretty strong. It's strong enough to, if you had a solution of pH 2 hydrochloric acid in a beaker and you threw in an iron nail in there, it's strong enough to dissolve a nail. So that's pretty powerful. You're like, well, that's extreme. What's the story? Well, one of the main reasons for the acidic nature of the gastric juice is that it really is a defensive mechanism. Think of all the bacteria. This is a scanning electron micrograph of bacteria, rod-shaped ones called bacillus. If this bacteria, we eat a lot of bacteria. Sure, we cook some of our food, but we don't cook all of our food. And so bacteria is constantly trying to get into our body, and it doesn't get past the stomach more often than not, because that acid is a real killer for bacteria. So it's a real protection that our body has. And then also, a curious thing is that the enzyme that the stomach produces, an enzyme called pepsin. And so I would want to emphasize that, because this is the major enzyme that is produced in gastric juice by the stomach lining. As it turns out, when you look at its activity, in other words, how fast it's working, and you're like, well, what does it do? It speeds up the breakdown of protein. And so what we call that is hydrolysis, water splitting of protein. So proteins, as you may know, are polypeptides, and as you can break them down with water, pepsin speeds that up. But what's curious is that pepsin, maybe not surprisingly, is most active at that low pH because that's the environment it normally resides. Just to contrast that, most enzymes of our body, cellular enzymes, don't like that kind of acidic environment. They work actually best around pH 7, truthfully. And so pepsin works really well in a strong environment, acidic environment. And this is actually a X-ray crystallography computer enhanced picture of the protein enzyme pepsin. Sometimes it's called a protease because it breaks down proteins. So what's interesting is the three-dimensional structure of an enzyme is really dependent on its environmental conditions. And so depending, if there's a lot of hydrogen ions, which is what an acid is going to be doing, HCl, it's going to alter the shape, just as a phosphate would alter the shape if it attached. These hydrogen ions are positively charged, so they influence the shape. And so what's interesting about this, if I can emphasize it, is that the enzyme pepsin is actually produced in a misshapen form, and the acidic environment actually changes it into an active form. And so it only works in that acidic environment. I find that to be very interesting. So changes in the shape influence the rate of the reaction, and so it only works well. So most active conformations lead to optimal reaction rate, meaning that the enzyme pepsin really only works well in an acidic environment. So I wanted to emphasize this. So inside the stomach, this is kind of interesting, I think. So the stomach cells are secreting this inactive enzyme, and this inactive enzyme is called pepsinogen. And so pepsinogen is a precursor. So it's like a pre-enzyme. And so only in there's a separate cell that's producing hydrochloric acid. So only in the environment of a pH 2, and so let's do that, pH 2, it's going to convert the pepsinogen, which is the inactive form, to an active form. I'll make it like red. Ooh. So this is more like the pepsin right there. And so, well, that's interesting, but how do we know that? I mean, really? Well, we could look at the reaction rate and determine the fact that pepsin really is optimal at that low pH. That's kind of interesting. We're going to discuss in a moment another enzyme in a separate video called trypsin, which, as you can see here, is most active at an alkaline pH, which is kind of interesting. So here we have the stomach again. Here's the sphincter. Here's some food that's in here, and here's the gastric juice being secreted. But if we really want to know what's going on, it's going to come down to the tissue level, and it's going to then come down to the cellular level. So here we are from organ to tissue. So this first tissue that has all this rugae right here is called the mucosal layer. Okay, so this is the epithelial lining. Now, it's sure that we have all that rugae, which helps to increase surface area, but check this out. There's literally holes in the mucosal layer called gastric pits, and sort of like a manhole, if you will, on the street. Although that's kind of gender bias, it's really just a worker's hole, sometimes called manhole. I guess women can go into it as well. So at any rate, you can go down into these pits, and when you go down into the pit, this is sort of looking at a profile here. You go down and it goes further and further down, and so these invaginations in the stomach actually increase the surface area right here. And so what's fascinating is all these cells collectively, since they do a lot of secreting, are considered to be a gland. So collectively, all these cells are referred to as the gastric gland. So gastric glands are groups of cells that are in the intestinal, in the gastric mucosal layer, and they're found in the pit. Okay, so if you look then at the cell level, so let's take a look down here on the bottom. You can see that there's some specialization in the cells. You have these cells called chief cells. These are the ones that are producing the enzyme pepsinogen. Remember, that's the precursor. And how do you activate it? Well, these parietal cells, shown here in yellow, but when you look at a real tissue, they're not colorful. But the parietal cells will produce the hydrochloric acid. And so this is kind of important because, like, what's the point of this in the first place? Well, again, and if you're going to have an enzyme that works well in an acidic environment, you've got to produce it in a precursor. And one of the things is, like, you don't want the enzyme digesting the cells itself. And so that's one way that it only becomes active when it's sort of in the lumen of the stomach, where most of the hydrochloric acid is, up here in the juice. And so I find this to be a little trivially interesting point, that the hydrochloric acid helps to convert pepsinogen to pepsin. So then you have the enzyme pepsin that's breaking down protein. But how about this? The pepsin itself also plays a positive role in converting more pepsinogen into pepsin. So it's a little bit of a positive feedback loop right there. That's kind of interesting. So pepsinogen is produced by the chief cells. So the protein is produced by the chief cells, and the parietal cells are the ones that are producing the hydrochloric acid. I always remember this. This is somewhat goofy, so maybe take it or leave it. Parietal always helps me to remember hydrochloric is HCl. That's how I always remember those two things. But that may not work for you. So as I was saying before, the conversion of pepsinogen into pepsin up here in the lumen of the stomach sort of helps to prevent the erosion of the mucosal layer. But the truth is, the mucosal layer is getting broken down a lot by pepsin and by the acid, and so it's constantly needing to regenerate itself. So I really like this diagram a lot. This is showing the rugae right here. This is focused on the mucosal layer right here, the mucous membrane. It's called mucous membrane because it's secreting mucus, it's secreting hydrochloric acid, it's secreting pepsin. So all of that makes gastric juice. And then again, right below that, we have the submucosa. So here are the cells right here. In all these cells collectively, let me do this for emphasis. All these cells are considered to be the gastric gland right there. And then the pits, which are not shown, like this. So if you're walking along like this, maybe use a different color so you can see. If you're walking along the stomach inside and you're like, whoa, falling into the pit. So here you are going into the pit, and then these cells make up the gland. And again, you have these mucus cells. Now these mucus cells I didn't mention before, but I'm going to emphasize now. They secrete mucus, which is water and mucin, and this is coating the cells of the stomach with an attempt to prevent the actual erosion of the lining itself. And then again, the parietal cells are producing hydrochloric acid, and the chief are producing the enzyme pepsin. So here's an actual picture. Gotta love it. So here's the pit right there. Here's where the food would be. There's a food right there. Maybe it's an egg yolk. And then here you have the gland itself. This is the gastric gland. And then along here would be the mucus cells, the parietal cells, and the chief cells. And so collectively, all of this is producing gastric juice. And so again, this is the same thing, but backing away, lower magnification. Also like this a lot. You can see the mucosal layer right up here. Here's the mucosal layer. And so all these cells are producing gastric juice. And then right below that is the submucosa. And then check this out. You're like, well, what's all this down here? Well, the stomach is really muscular. And so one of the things about the stomach is, all the layers of the alimentary canal are the same. There's 4, the mucosa, submucosa, muscle, and serosa. So the thing is, the muscle happens to be really profound in the stomach because it has to do all that squeezing and churning. And so here's the circular and then longitudinal smooth muscle. That's pretty cool. Okay, and this is where the food would be in the stomach. And so again, here's a focus of the gastric gland. Here's the pit up here. Gastric juice is coming out this way. Here's the submucosa down below. And so what you have here is the mucus that is being secreted by the mucus cells are coating, and it's trying to protect the stomach lining, but still there's continual erosion of these cells. So these cells are taking a beating in the stomach. And so how about this? The rate of mitosis is like every 3 days the mucosal layer is replaced by new cells. So that's pretty rapid. And so, there can be more damage done. And so take a look at this. This is a picture, again, a stomach dissected, and you can see this irritation here is referred to as an ulcer. And so gastric ulcers in particular are lesions of the stomach lining. And what we've found is, that they could be, made worse by the acidic nature of the stomach, but ultimately one of the major causes of gastric ulcers, as it turns out, is a bacterium. And it's like, well, remember how we were saying before that bacteria come to the end of their life when they come in when you eat them in our stomach. But how about this? There's some bacteria out there that are acid tolerant. That's not good. And so one of them in particular is called Helicobacter pylori. So H for the genus, capital H, and then lowercase pylori. So H. pylori bacteria can sometimes get into our stomach and start causing trouble. And so one of the big ways in which physicians can treat that is with antibiotics, which will come in and dominate and destroy that bacteria. And so that's a curiosity. And so as it turns out, the stomach's constantly churning, so the muscles are contracting and it's mixing all that gastric juice, and all of that acidic food is referred to as chyme. And you might be familiar with it. Sorry about mentioning this, but if you've ever vomited, you kind of know it's a burning of the esophagus. It's acidic, and it's kind of a highly fluid, broken down food situation. And so all of that's going on inside the stomach, all that churning. And so one of the problems that people can have in terms of a disorder is that their lower esophageal sphincter maybe doesn't close properly. A couple of different causes of this. Maybe just with age it begins to break down, and so as a result the churning of the stomach causes some of the acidic chyme to backflow up into the esophagus, and the esophagus isn't quite as protected as the stomach from this acid environment, so you get this burning occurring chronically, and so that's referred to as heartburn. And so there's different treatments for this. There's different stages. You can give a person antacids to sort of neutralize this, like a buffer, which minimizes the effects, but it can be even treated surgically if it gets to be really bad. And so coming down here in this fundic area right in here, here's the pyloric sphincter. Notice how it's very thick in this area. This is the upper part of the small intestine known as the duodenum or duodenum. So the pyloric sphincter is the gatekeeper. It keeps the food from leaving the stomach too quickly. It's sort of a gatekeeper, if you will, because it only allows like a squirt at a time of the food to leave the stomach. So that's why it takes a couple of hours for a meal to actually empty out of the stomach. And so here's an actual picture of the pyloric sphincter right here. You can see the rugae there, and you see how muscular it truly is. And so the last part of the video is a discussion of hormones that help to regulate digestion. And hormones are really important. They're chemicals that are secreted into the blood, just a little review, that help a target cell do something that it wasn't normally doing. And so there's some hormones that are released by the wall of the stomach. Okay, so the stomach can act as a gland. We were talking about it acting as a gland before, but now it's acting as an endocrine gland because it's secreting a hormone. And then how about this? The wall of the duodenum itself is also secreting hormones, which influences digestion. And so let's talk about these things. First off, I wanted to say that, like the salivary glands, gastric juices can be stimulated by the brain. In other words, by sensory perception of the fact that there's food present. It might initiate the production of gastric juice. But you need something a little bit more profound than just that. And so there's some hormones that help to regulate gastric juice formation. Think about it. If you only want gastric juice when there's food in the stomach, you don't want to be producing gastric juice when you're in between meals. It wouldn't be a good idea. And so the food itself logically stimulates the stomach wall, which is where the hormone is being produced, to secrete the hormone gastrin. So again, I always like a name that I'm going to always easily remember. So gastrin is the name of the hormone that helps to positively promote gastric juice. And so how about this? The stomach produces the hormone which actually stimulates itself to produce more gastric juice. So gastrin is produced by the stomach, and it stimulates further production of gastric juice. And so if the pH becomes too acidic, so gastric juice, remember gastric juice has a lot of HCl. If the stomach becomes too acidic, that will have a negative or inhibitory role in the secretion of gastrin. And so this way it's able to negative feedback its own regulation, its own secretion. So that's kind of interesting. And so let me repeat that. And so if you remember, the parietal cells are producing hydrochloric acid, okay? And then over here, let's talk about the hormone gastrin is being secreted, and it goes into the bloodstream. And so the hormone gastrin is telling the cells to produce pepsinogen, and gastrin's telling the cells to produce more hydrochloric acid. But as the pH becomes too acidic, it's going to negatively influence the production of the hormone gastrin. So that's a way to shut it off. Okay, and so I was also mentioning the duodenum being capable of secreting. So check this out. As the acidic food, and it's really acidic, and do you remember how I was mentioning it's kind of a problem for the esophagus? So it's going to be kind of a problem for the intestine as well if you have this like raging acid river coming out of the stomach into the duodenum. And so how about this? The acidic pH of the chyme entering into the duodenum will stimulate the cells, the mucosal layer of the duodenum. I'm going to just switch in between those pronunciations. So it's going to cause these cells of the intestine to secrete the hormone called, how about this, secretin. And this was one of the very first hormones that was ever characterized. And so I guess they thought it was cute to call it secretin because what its function is to get the pancreas, which is not shown. I shall draw it in. Here's this feathery gland that's sitting sort of posterior to the stomach. It gets these cells in here to start secreting digestive enzymes, which will then enter into the small intestine. So the hormone itself was called secretin. Although I have to say I'm not a fan of the name, even though it's kind of cute, because a lot of hormones cause other target cells to secrete, and so it's a little generic for me. But it's produced by the intestine, and it causes the pancreas to start secreting. And one of the stimuli is the acidic nature of the chyme that's coming in. And then one of the things that's in the pancreatic juice, we'll be talking about the pancreas in a separate video, but I'll just foreshadow it. Pancreatic juice not only has digestive enzymes, but it has a base called sodium bicarbonate, which helps to neutralize the acid and taking it up in pH back up to 7. So it goes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it even takes it further up to 8 and sometimes 9. So it turns it from an acidic environment to an alkaline environment very quickly. So that's kind of cool, and the hormone secretin does that. And so here's the pancreas. The pancreas starts secreting when the hormone secretin, which is produced by the cells of the duodenum, produce secretin, and then secretin travels in the bloodstream to the pancreas, which causes it to start secreting. And so here's another hormone that's really cool. It's like a hormone, big pronunciation here, you ready? Cholecystokinin, CCK for short. It's secreted also by the duodenum. Okay, so it's synthesized by the mucosal layer of the epithelium of the small intestine. But what it's doing is it sort of does that in response to the presence of amino acids in fattier foods. And so it does a couple of things. And so I'll just sort of it causes the gallbladder to contract. And so the gallbladder is underneath your liver, which is not shown here. And it's going to cause the gallbladder to contract, which is going to release this sort of green material called bile down the common bile duct and enter into the small intestine. So that's kind of cool. And it also causes the release of pancreatic enzymes as well. So secretin and cholecystokinin have redundant function in that capacity. So CCK also increases the production of bile, and here's now the liver. These are ducts that lead from this big gland down. And what's interesting is there's a sphincter that controls it. You don't want all of this bile to just be pouring in constantly, only when there's food present. And so how about this? The hormone CCK, when the food is present, will then cause the gallbladder to contract. It'll also cause that sphincter right there, called the sphincter of Oddi, to loosen up, which will then allow the pancreatic juice, for which it's stimulating, to be deposited in the small intestine. So that's pretty awesome. So I hope you enjoyed this look at the stomach, and really it was a look at the sort of the whole upper GI a little bit, because I went into the small intestine. And so I hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.